Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew, and I'm a programmer working from home, which I think a lot of people are in our situation right now, and it's given us a unique perspective at looking at how our code sort of affects us. And, the safe space movement has only been growing recently, and if you're basically a social justice warrior like me, I've got a few ideas on how we can use social justice to try and refine the code and make it a safer space for everybody who's working inside the code base. So I have three ideas which I'm going to present to you today. The first one is called no slavery. So this is actually an idea that is pretty prevalent already inside the code bases of the world. A few big companies have already made the news for this. Here's an article I read recently doing research for this project, which was about Google's transition. So in 2019, Google's diversity and inclusion team basically determined that it would be a little disrespectful if the code continued to reference certain things as masters and slaves. Obviously, this does have a reference to slavery, which was certainly a problem in the United States, and most of the world, and it's still a problem today. As you guys know, I care very deeply about slavery. I think this is one of the modern biggest problems of our time. So I think the diversity and inclusion team was probably in a good position here. This article is a little critical. They call it a hyper woke movement, which obviously, that's being a little critical. But I do think it does affect you on a deep level if every time you're referencing a helper method, you're, typing the word slavery, and you're asking, and you're calling these things slaves and stuff like that. So I do think that there is sort of maybe subtle influences that it has that maybe make people feel a little uncomfortable. This is sort of a crude parallel, but it'd be kind of like if you called SQL injection I don't know, like rape or something, right? Like if you referred to it like that, I think people would feel very uncomfortable. And so I think generally one of the ideas would be for us to change all of the references. Instead of saying that they are slave objects, we could just call them helper objects. So that would be kind of my solution for this. Now, obviously, that it doesn't sound great, right? Like you can imagine if you went to, I don't know, like a slave plantation, and the slave owner said to you, "Oh, these are just my little helpers." Obviously, it's still slavery. It's still not okay. But in this case, it's just a computer programming helping us. So I do think it's ethical. However, maybe we don't have to use the connotations that are implying that it's, something evil. So that's my thoughts on that. My second idea is called no gods. Okay, and so it's pretty common in code that we'll refer to something called a god object. This is a pretty often referenced paradigm, which is actually an anti-pattern. So this god object is actually considered pretty bad, and over time, the coders have kind of been a little anti-religious. I think Turing is probably an example of situations that haven't panned out so well for programmers dealing with the whole religious situation. However, I don't think that we need to have political implications of how is your theism or whatever the opposite is. What is it called? People who don't believe in God and atheists. How's your atheism gonna play a role in the code base? We could just remove that. If you don't like God, we don't need to come up with some pejorative that makes fun of the code, calling it a God object. So unfortunately, it is a little bit more complicated than that, and we're going to start talking about the pasta now, because it would seem that while the God object is disrespected, the opposite pattern considered the ravioli code is sort of the respected paradigm, which is where code is encapsulated. For reference, this on the left here is a picture of a ravioli where it's nice and encapsulated. Then there's also this concept of a flat structured code base, which is sometimes referred to as the lasagna code. And then I also found this other one called the pizza code, which again I think is referring to this flat architecture. But you'll notice that the several different layers that would be present in a lasagna are absent here. Okay, so here's what I think about that. I think it's ridiculous, guys. I think there's way too many analogies with respect to pasta and God in the code. I think what we need to do is just completely disassociate from all this political and gluten nonsense, and instead we should just describe it how it is. So if you want to say flat structured hierarchy, don't say lasagna code, say flat structured code, right? I think there's a lot of ways that we can do this in an appropriate way. And I did think it was a little bit of a play between like this atheism sect and this like monotheism situation. But then I realized one of the most common references is actually the spaghetti code. You might have heard of this. And spaghetti code is like one of the worst kind of codes you could have. However, the spaghetti monster is also like this big icon in like the atheism sphere, right? This whole like religion of the spaghetti monster. So all in all, I think if we remove the references, we're not going to have any of this nonsense. You're not going to offend monotheists or polytheists by having this sort of anti-God reference by saying the God object is like this terrible thing. You're not going to offend the celiac disease people who can't enjoy pasta and other gluten products. And then, you know, the atheists can have, you know, the spaghetti monster nonsense somewhere else. So that's my plan. Basically, just remove the references. And I think that's the best solution we could come up with there. Okay, then the third issue is I would say we need to have no exclamation points. I think just in general, in a code base where you see these exclamation points popping up all the time, it can be very triggering because it feels like somebody's yelling at you. Now, there's a lot of ways that this could be worse, right? Here's an error message. It says you don't have enough privileges for this action, right? And if we want to talk about, you know, checking your privilege and that whole thing, that's a whole nother story. But I think in this case, basically, the reason why it's bad is because there's an exclamation point here. It feels like I'm being yelled at by the code. And obviously, I don't appreciate that. I don't think it's conducive to a safe space work environment. I don't have an issue with the iconography of the exclamation point because I understand that's like internationally recognized symbol. This is like from check warning light or engine check or whatever. Like these icons are pretty commonplace and they're symbolizing, hey, you know, you have a warning situation. My conflict is where we have the exclamation point in the error message because that's where I feel like I'm getting yelled at, whereas with the iconography, I just feel like it's kind of a notification. So again, the fix here would be similar. It's very simple. We could just go into the code base, replace the exclamation points, all with periods, and I think you're going to have a much nicer time because it's going to feel like people are, you know, if you read it back, it's like, you don't have enough privileges for this action instead of you don't have enough privileges for this action. So, you know, it does read a lot nicer, and I do think all these subtle changes are going to make a big difference. And if Google is willing to spend over $10,000 refining their code base to create a safe space for their workers, then the least we could do is change a few exclamation points to periods. So here's a diverse group of coders to end the video. I just want to say thanks. And if you have ideas on how we can improve the code base to make it a better safe space, let me know in the comment section. And if maybe you think that the movement's going too far, you disagree with some of the points I made, I'd love to hear, you know, to what extent you agree or disagree as well in the comment section below. All right, so I think that's it for this video. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.